Hello there. Welcome to this revision lesson for AQA GCSE History. So we are looking at Paper 1A, Germany from Democracy to Dictatorship. And in this lesson, we are going to look at the period of Weimar Germany. And we're going to investigate just how far the German Republic recovered in the period 1924 to 1928. So hopefully you will all recall that the period from 1919 to 1923 was a period of crisis for Weimar Germany. There were numerous attempts to overthrow the Republic from both the left and the right. There was the French and Belgian invasion of the Ruhr, and then of course there was the severe inflation which wiped out people's savings. Historians often regard the period of 1924 to 1928 as a period of recovery, at least on the surface. So by the end of this revision lesson, hopefully you'll be able to tick off this checklist here. You will be able to explain the extent of recovery under Stresemann. And of course, he had two roles, first as Chancellor, then as Foreign Minister. Hopefully, you'll be able to explain that under Stresemann, a new currency was introduced, and a series of loans were agreed with the United States, particularly the Dawes Plan. Stresemann was also, in his role as Foreign Minister, very influential in negotiating the Locarno Treaty, which paved the way for Germany to be admitted to the League of Nations. You're also going to need to explain why the Weimar Republic, or why the period rather from 1924 to 1928 is referred to as the Golden Age of the Republic. And so we'll need to know about the cultural and artistic achievements of the period as well. So what is the key content that you will need to be able to apply to a range of different exam questions? Well, first of all, in his role as Chancellor, Stresemann immediately called off the passive resistance and to restart reparation payments if French and Belgian troops would withdraw from the Ruhr. So hopefully you will recall that the German government were paying the industrial workers in the Ruhr to go on strike. So this was a form of passive resistance. They would not cooperate with the French and Belgian troops. That in itself was fueling the severe inflation. So Stresemann calls off this passive resistance on the condition that French and Belgian troops would withdraw from Germany. Once that was in place, Stresemann, in his role as Chancellor, immediately began to set about tackling hyperinflation. He introduced a new currency called the Rentenmark. So that's the crucial point here. It was based not on gold, but on German land and other forms of German wealth. Unfortunately, for those families, for the middle classes in particular, who had lost their savings, they would never ever get their savings back, and that would, still be a very, very sore point for those people. So the big agreement that you really need to know about, of course, was the Dawes Plan. Now, this came out of the Dawes Committee, which was chaired by Charles Dawes. Charles Dawes was a US banker. He was also the vice president. And this plan, once it was ratified, brought an end to the French and Belgian occupation of Germany. A staggered payments of reparations was established. So rather than having to pay in big lump sums, the payments would be staggered over a longer period of time. Now, crucially, an initial loan of $800 million was also agreed to help revive German industry. So Dawes recognised that if Germany was to be able to continue to pay reparations, it would need an immediate injection of money to get German industry going again, so that then Germany could stand on its own feet and would be able to, or be in a better position to honour the reparation payments. That was the start of a huge amount of American money that would be poured into Germany in the 1920s. And it worked, because by 1925, German industrial production was back up to its pre-war levels. Now, Charles Dawes would receive the Nobel Peace Prize for the Dawes Plan, and it was regarded very much as a success. Now, to further develop that point, for those of you that want to take a deeper dive, what you would need to talk about, of course, was how this initial loan of $800 million, really got the German economy going. So by 1925, as I've already mentioned, German industrial production is back up to its pre-First World War levels. Businesses were prospering. We see new industries like the motor car industry and radio, telephones, aircraft, all doing well as the traditional industries such as shipbuilding. So on the surface, at least on the surface, it looks as if the economy was thriving. Now, so this is also a golden age in German culture. Now, the Weimar Constitution, when it was drawn up in the town of Weimar in 1919, it was one of the most democratic constitutions in Europe at the time. Under the Kaiser, of course, the German people had been subject to a strict authoritarian regime and strict levels of control and censorship, but all of that was relaxed. And so because of these freedoms, and because now the economic conditions had settled down, so the very conditions of democracy had been established, what we see in Germany is this a massive revival in the arts and in culture. So cinema, for example, became very, very popular in Weimar, Germany. And one of the standout films in Europe at the time was a film called Metropolis, which was directed by Fritz Lang. And it was often regarded, still is regarded actually, as one of the most technically advanced films of the decade. You can find it on YouTube, have a watch. It's a really good film, and it's a film about a kind of a dystopian future. Actresses like Marlene Dietrich also became world famous, and she made her name playing glamorous and strong-willed women. If you wanted a night out in Europe in the 1920s, then Berlin was the place to go. It became the party capital of the world. Many musicians would perform quite amusing and often quite vulgar songs about politicians. So just again illustrating the freedoms excuse me, that German people now had. There was also a big drug culture in Germany at the time. Now, years later, the Nazi Party would often point to this era as proof that the German Republic was a decadent chapter in German history, and there were many people who weren't entirely happy with these changes. Now, art also flourished during the era of the Weimar Republic from 1924 to 1928. Avant-garde, which of course means new and experimental ideas, this became very, very dominant in German art. Artists such as Otto Dix and George Grosz, they believe that art should reflect the reality of everyday life and get people thinking. And so, artists were, and art really flourished from this lack of control and lack of censorship. The painting that you can see on the presentation is a very interesting one. This is a painting by George Grosz, and it's, on the one hand, it shows how much freedom artists had, because it's very, very critical of the German government at the time. And on the other hand, it's useful to historians because it does show us that there were very contemporary concerns about what was really bubbling away under the surface in Germany, that the problems hadn't really gone away. So what you can see in this painting is President Hindenburg. Now, as I mentioned in a moment, in 1926, in the presidential elections, the German voters swung dramatically to the right by voting for Hindenburg, who of course was this right-wing authoritarian figure. He'd been Kaiser Wilhelm's field marshal in the First World War, and he'd become the head of state. And he even wrote a letter to the Kaiser, who was now, of course, in exile in the Netherlands, asking for permission to take up the role. And what we see on next to Hindenburg, of course, is an American financier. Seems to be whispering into the president's ear. And, Grosz is really making the point that the German Republic was under the control of the interests of big finance. And we can see that also symbolized by the dollar symbol in the corner. The politicians in Hindenburg's cabinet are portrayed as having no heads, which kind of suggests that they're clueless, and he symbolizes the German electorate as a blindfolded donkey going to the ballot box. And underneath that, of course, we see a human skeleton. So really, he's making the point that the German government is headed in a quite dangerous direction. And of course, this painting proved to be quite prophetic, because, as we all know, and as you should remember, it is President Hindenburg who appoints Hitler Chancellor in 1933. So, as I've already mentioned, many Germans, of course, objected to this sort of to these cultural changes. Many more conservative Germans wanted culture to be reflective of more traditional German values, and there were many people at the time who believed that Germany was being led into moral decline. And this is exactly what the National Socialists would say some years later, of course, when they were campaigning after the impact of the Great Depression. So this leads us into quite nicely a general discussion around how far had Germany actually recovered. So on the surface, it looked like this was indeed a golden age. No one in 1926, for example, would have ever have imagined that an obscure Bavarian politician like Adolf Hitler would become Chancellor in 1933. Just at the time, that would have seemed impossible. So on the surface, the German economy was much improved. Germany had regained its international status by being admitted into the League of Nations and signing the Locarno Treaty, which of course had rubber stamped their acceptance of the territorial losses incurred under the Treaty of Versailles. However, if we dig deeper, then we can see really that the problems were still there. Hindenburg, of course, is now the president. So from President Eber, who was a socialist, there's this big swing back towards the right. The German electorate clearly felt that they wanted a more traditional right-wing authoritarian leader as president. So this led to a lot of criticism that there was still too much of the old Germany lurking behind the scenes. Germany, of course, was still paying reparations. And what had happened, of course, not only do they owe billions in reparations, but now they also owe significant amounts of money to American financiers. All the recovery really was based on borrowing, and that is a fragile guarantee of prosperity. The American loans that were authorized under the Dawes Plan could be recalled at any moment, and of course, when the American economy crashed in 1929, that's exactly what would happen. Democracy could still be suspended. Under the Weimar Constitution, Article 48 gave the president emergency powers in a time of a national emergency. Democracy could be suspended. And of course, if you remember, it was after 1933. The extreme political parties were still around. The Nazi Party was now busy reorganizing itself after Hitler's release from prison. So there, on the face of it, Germany appeared to have recovered, but we don't have to look too far or scratch the surface too much to see that the problems were still there. Okay, so at this point in this online lesson, I would like you now to pause the presentation, and I would like you to make some general notes, whether through mind maps or bulleted notes under key questions. It's entirely up to you how you set your work out, whatever way of learning suits you. I would like you to make some generalized notes on how far Germany had recovered. I'd like you to focus on the economic agreements. I'd like you to focus on the improvements in the economy. I'd like you to focus on, of course, the international agreements such as the Dawes Plan. Sorry, not the Dawes Plan, beg your pardon, the Locarno Treaty in particular, and Germany's admittance to the League of Nations. The Dawes Plan, of course, is an economic change. And I'd also like you to focus on some of the cultural achievements. Give yourselves around 15 to 20 minutes to do that, and then you can hit play again. Okay, well, welcome back. So we're now going to have a look at applying this content to a question 6, a potential question 6. So as you know, question 6 is the 12-mark bullet question. They will always give you 2 bullets, so you must explain your answer with reference to both of the bullets. You can't include in your answer anything else, okay, because it simply won't be credited. And then you'll need to write an overall conclusion, okay, in which you come to a judgment as to which bullet was, in this context, the most important reason for German recovery in the period 1924 to 1928. So the question is asking you, which of the following was the most important reason for German recovery up to 1928? Was it economic agreements, or was it the international agreements? Okay, so what I've done for you on this presentation is to give you a little plan. So one of the fundamental skills, of course, in AO1 and AO2 is directing your explanation to the issue in the question. Now, to do that, of course, you will need to examine a range of evidence as to the economic agreements that were established, and then more importantly, you must direct that to the question and explain how these economic agreements underpinned the recovery of Germany. And again, you must do exactly the same for the international agreement. So there's a plan there in place that you can use to help you plan this answer. But what I want to do is just to talk you through this process, how we build progression in this answer so that we can, hit the very, very highest levels of the mark scheme. Okay. And really, we're back to our P, aren't we? We're back to point, evidence, explain. That is the fundamental skill that we must use when structuring our paragraphs. So let's just go through economic agreements. Okay, so you would like to ideally start your paragraph with a really, really well-focused big point that establishes the case that you're going to make in this paragraph. So it could read something like, the economic agreements reached by Stresemann in his role as Chancellor were clearly an important factor in German recovery. So you, again, nice and well focused, use the wording of the question in your opening point. Just as you don't need to write an introduction. That's not required at GCSE at all, really, particularly not for this 12-mark question. So you just jump straight into your answer, and you start your first paragraph with a nice, clear, big point that uses the wording of the question. Now that you've made your big point, you're going to need to substantiate it with some evidence. So you could say, as I have here, that Stresemann called off passive resistance in the Ruhr, which, of course, as we know, had been causing the German economy to overheat, to inflate. That's your first point. Second point, in addition, so you're building, you're building your case, you're building substantiation into your answer. Stresemann introduced a new currency, the Rettermark, to replace the old one, which was worthless. Now, an additional piece of evidence, again, you're clearly now substantiating your initial point with evidence. So in 1924, Stresemann agreed to the Dawes Plan, which provided a loan of $800 million. Now, this is all well and good, but this is a crucial thing. If you left your answer like that, then this paragraph could only be leveled at level 2. So if I was marking this and you'd left your first paragraph like this, then I would mark it at level 2. It hasn't got beyond level 2. Why? Well, clearly because a point has been made, and it's also been developed with some appropriate supporting evidence. However, we have still not explained how this evidence links to the issue in the question. So we haven't explained how this led to German recovery. Okay, so we now need to start to think about our causes and particularly our consequences. Okay, how did these economic initiatives lead to German recovery? That's the explanation part. Okay, so we got our point, we've got our evidence. We now need to explain how our evidence relates to the question. So how did this lead to German economic recovery? Okay, so you could explain, as I have here, that these economic measures allowed Germany to recover in the following ways. Firstly, the influx of $800 billion allowed German industry to get back on its feet. German steel production had reached its pre-war levels by 1925, and Germany was once more one of the most powerful economies in Europe. In addition to this, alongside a growth in exports, increased industrial production led to a rise in wages of up to 10%. And secondly, the newly created prosperity. And this is a very important point. The newly created prosperity created political stability, and support for the extreme parties such as the communists and the Nazis declined. In this period, of course, there were no more attempts to overthrow the Republic. That, I think, is a really, really important point. Okay, just cross-reference for a moment to paper 1B, conflict and tension, when we looked at the launching of the Marshall Plan. And George Marshall and President Truman understood that if democracy was going to flourish in post-war Europe, the conditions for democracy had to be established. And of course, that's economic prosperity. So the recovery of the German economy, was the prime cause of the of the political recovery in this time, the fact that things had settled down, and we know that in 1928 the Nazi Party had very, very few seats in the German Reichstag. So they've become a political irrelevance. So I think that's a very, very important point. So the answer has now, in our mark scheme again, is developed to a level 3. Okay, this is now a developed explanation, and we're showing evidence of developed thinking. Okay, the candidate has directed the evidence to the question, and has also mentioned how this creates political stability as well. So the initial evidence that was employed to substantiate the opening point has now been focused to the issue in the question. Okay, now if we want to get to the very top levels, to level 4, the candidate must repeat the exact same process in their second paragraph. So there needs to be a point, evidence, and an explanation, and then the third paragraph, in which the candidate must come to a fully substantiated judgment. So let's have a look at that. So your judgment is, having explained why economic agreements were important for German recovery in your first paragraph. In your second paragraph, you would go on to explain why international agreements were also important to German recovery. So in your third paragraph, this is where you reach your conclusion. Okay, this is where you've got to weigh up the balance of evidence. Which was it? Which was the most important? Yes, you can sometimes sit on the fence and say, well, actually, they perhaps there's a parity. They're both important, but I think examiners would really like you to come to some overall substantive judgment. So I've given you an example here. This is what I would say if I was writing this question. I would say that, on balance, having considered, both views, that the economic agreements were more important. I would point to the fact that the Locarno Treaty, led to Germany's admission to the League of Nations, which of course, increased Germany's international prestige. However, it did also cause a lot of anger and unrest among more nationalist groups in Germany, who had been angry that Germany had surrendered, had been angry that Germany had lost a huge amount of territory, and now the German government was just rolling over and accepting that. And that did, feed into the hands, particularly to the right-wing parties. I would suggest that was one reason why why President Hindenburg was elected in 1925. Now, I'd also argue, on the other hand, although Germany continued to pay reparations, again, which angered some nationalist groups, the economic measures created the conditions for both not just economic stability, but, as we established in the first paragraph, political stability as well. There was an increase in the standard of living and a rise in wages, and that was enough for most people to forget the crisis, the inflation crisis of 1923. That's the conclusion that I would come to. Of course, it might not be the conclusion that you would come to. Hopefully, though, what you're seeing, okay, is how you would structure your conclusion. It's not one or two lines in conclusion. I think that it is what the examiners are looking for, a substantiated judgment. And that, if you are able to do that, and having produced two proper P paragraphs for the main body, you are now showing evidence of complex thinking, and that will catapult you into the top level of the mark scheme. The judgment, as I've said there, isn't simply asserted. It is supported by precisely selected evidence in 2 to 3 fully developed sentences. And so, lastly, and we'll have a look at some more of these as well, some more examples of substantiated judgments in future lessons. But what you're often required to do is think about the interrelationship between these two factors. Would Germany have been in a position to broker international agreements if the economic issues had not been fixed? And I think the answer is no, they wouldn't. It was absolutely essential to get the economy going before Germany could make could improve its international standing. Were the international agreements welcomed by most Germans? Then the presidential election of 1926 would seem to say no. The fact they've elected a war hero who himself Hindenburg was one of those early voices that were talking about the German army being stabbed in the back. Were the Dawes plans and Young plan really a foundation for recovery? The Young plan, of course, which came in 1928-1929, in which Germany would have been paying reparations right the way until 1989-1990, that really did play into the hands of right-wing agitators, particularly the Nazi Party. Okay, so lots to think about. As part of your revision preparations, it would be a very good idea, at the very least, to complete or have a go rather at planning this question and maybe even writing your own P paragraph for the international agreements. Okay, if you might also want to have a go at completing the whole question, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, everyone. Well, I will see you next time. Bye for now.